Good afternoon and welcome to Community Conversations for Wednesday, September the 15th of 2021. Community Conversations are sponsored by the Interfaith Leaders Coalition and hosted by English Lutheran Church. I am Pastor Park Hunter. I'm the pastor at Onalaska United Methodist Church and the coordinator of the Interfaith Leaders. And this year, as last year, we're having to adapt to the pandemic. So today we're going to be online only, and as the year progresses, we'll watch the COVID levels here in La Crosse and we'll adapt. Just pay attention to our website. We are live streaming this on YouTube. If you are watching while the presentation is live, we encourage you to join us in the chat on YouTube. You're going to need a Google or Gmail account in order to participate there. And you can post questions, which I will ask of our guests during the at the end of the presentation in the last 10 or 15 minutes. A recording of today's program will also be available on our website at interfaithleaders.org. And so if you found this helpful today and you want to share it with somebody, watch there, and within a day or two, the program will be up. Looking ahead this fall, in October, our conversation will be a week early on October the 13th, and it will be a primer on Black Lives Matter. And in November, we're going to have another panel discussion on mental health that will be hosted by Viterbo University. We thank you for coming today, and I want to turn it over to Pastor Glenn of English Lutheran to offer a prayer as we begin.
Thanks, Park. Glad to have you here. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the beauty of the fall weather. We thank you for the wonder of our technology that enables us to gather together virtually to discuss things in ways that we wouldn't have thought possible before. Bless the conversation today and help us to find solutions to the problem of labor in today's market. Amen.
Thank you, Glenn. Our topic today is where's our workforce, the labor supply, and where is everyone? If you've been out and about in La Crosse or other places over the summer, you've noticed restaurants that may have been closed for a day while they're waiting or looking for employees. We know that it's a tight market for finding workers right now. At the same time, we know there are a lot of people who are not looking for jobs right now. And to try to explore this, we've asked three guests to come and share perspectives. This panel consists of TJ Brooks. TJ is the interim dean of the College of Business Administration at UW La Crosse and brings an academic perspective. Megan Harsey comes to us as the director of recruiting and co-worker experience for the Quick Trip Corporation and will speak with some perspective from that of employers. And then Theresa Pierce is the Executive Director of Workforce Connections, a private nonprofit that assists folks who are looking for jobs and can speak some from the perspective of those who are in the job market. And to begin with, I'm going to turn it over to TJ. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is very strange, presenting to a room of two people, but knowing more than that are out here. So let me just say that there's an advantage to procrastinating that I discovered today, and that is, as the other panelists gave me their slides, I realized they're going to cover everything that matters. They're the true experts here. So my job is just to prevent a few graphs and maybe add a joke or two. That's what I'll do. As was mentioned, I'm the interim dean of the College of Business. I do have academic training in economics, although my kids don't believe me. I do have some related expertise, I guess. I usually have some sort of disclaimer where I realize that, or I make sure that everybody understands that I don't speak for my employer. My mother has asked me to also add her into that mix, that I don't speak for her since she's listened to me talk on occasions and disagrees with me. So the first thing I want to start with sort of is that there are lots of different perspectives on the labor shortage. I think we'll hear some concerns, but labor economists sometimes say things as was written in the New York Times recently, that the good news, there's a labor shortage. Economists also, we like to point out that oftentimes there's no such thing really as a shortage or a surplus, there's just a wrong price, right? So a labor shortage to an economist means that wages are just too low, and that's why this particular economist wrote about sort of it being good news, it meaning an increase in wages. I love showing this graph. This is to give you a sense of the pandemic. This is weekly initial jobless claims as they come through, going back into the 70s. And you can see that before the pandemic, they had fallen dramatically. They were very low as a percentage of the labor force. And then, as we all know, COVID hit. So this is massive, right? I mean, like if you think about it, in no time in our history have we had that kind of massive dislocation in labor. Even the Great Depression, it was a slower dislocation than this. And at the end of the day, may have exceeded it, but it was not as rapid and as fast as what we see here. So I think this gives a very good perspective. So when we think about the labor challenges that we face, we have to remember that just 18 months ago, we faced the largest dislocation in workers that we've seen. The data that I want to show you, though, is a little bit of a puzzle. It's a puzzle because oftentimes we think just about the unemployment rate. And when the unemployment rate goes up, we think that's a bad economy. And when it goes down, we think that's a better economy. But it only tells a part of the story, particularly now. And this was actually true before the pandemic. The other indicators in the labor market were very important to sort of look at. We had, I mean, the labor shortage idea predates the pandemic, the skills gap, other terms that you've heard. So I'll give an explanation, a little bit of that. This is just a picture of a smaller window of the unemployment rate to see how starkly it increases and how it has fallen, not quite to the level that it was at pre-pandemic, but it's fallen dramatically. There is an important difference, though. We don't have as many jobs, not as much employment. This is what it looks like for the region. So here I have the counties of the Seven Rivers region. You can see Jackson County, Vernon, Winona, et cetera. So the picture is basically the same everywhere. We have a dramatic sort of rise in the unemployment rate and then a dramatic fall, but we're not quite back to the level that we were at previously. Some of the data that's going to help us understand where this challenge comes from is in what's referred to as the JOLTS data, the Job Openings Labor Turnover Survey that's put together. This gives us some information on job openings, gives us some information on people who are quitting jobs, and then people who are laid off as well. And you can see the couple of dramatic things here. You see a dramatic spike recently in the job openings on the leftmost side, and then you can see the job layoffs and how dramatic that they were. You already saw that in the weekly claims data. What's important here is to see this job openings data. So we have a dramatic historic rise in the number of job openings, which is a source of the puzzle, right? Extra demand that is appearing in the labor market. But as I mentioned, the number of jobs that are out there aren't quite what we have seen previously. So to sort of focus in on it and look at this particular graph, all this includes non-farm employment. And this is the thing that we look at that tells us about the state of the economy. You can see the contraction in employment that occurs here in the spring of 2020. And we are not quite to that level that we were previously at. We're still several million jobs behind. So even though we have lots of job openings, the number of actual people working is still far below the pre-pandemic level. So we're continuing to make gains. If you look at previous recessions, this recovery has been much quicker. It took us 8 years to fully recover from the previous one. And that's been a trend, right? That there's a sort of very slow recovery that happens in the employment side of things. This one has been quicker, but it still is going to take some time. The picture that I really want to focus on that shares with us this understanding that part of the labor shortage is also people that are out of the labor market that would have previously been in the labor market. They're still on the sidelines. So these people aren't counted in the unemployed because they're not actively looking for work. And so this is why the unemployment rate doesn't fully capture the picture. This is called the prime, the economists refer to this as the prime EPOP. So it's the prime age employment to population ratio, and gives us a sense of who's working. You can see it peaked back in 2000, and it's fallen since 2000. But again, previous to the pandemic, it was getting close to those all-time peaks. but we're still well below where we would expect to be. So there's a lot of workers who are out of the labor market, and I know our experts will have something to say about their guesses as to why people are out of the labor market and possibly strategies for getting them back in the labor market. But this is really the source. That previous picture that showed the unprecedented job openings really represents our demand side of things, and this really represents our labor supply side of things, and the gap between these two is really the source of the shortage. This is just presenting the data as we see it. It's not presenting any explanations per se. That's not my job. No, I actually reached out to a couple labor economists last night on Twitter, some friends of mine, and said, you know, I've got to give a talk on this tomorrow. Do you have any answers? And in typical economist fashion, one of them said, we have no idea really at the moment what's going on. And I think it'll be about another 10 years before we fully figure out what was happening. So the advantage of being an academic economist and living in ivory tower is we can take a long time to figure out what's been going on. The disadvantage that my colleagues will have is that they're living in the moment and have to try to solve some of these problems. We do have some ideas of the sources of these problems, but I really want to give this picture of where this sort of difference is. So you can see this little bracket here on the slides. That bracket represents sort of where we used to be in terms of the labor force, the number of people who are willing to work and were working or looking. And then the green line, which is the actual employed. This is sort of a measure of the true unemployment rate, if you will, from the standpoint of the difference between the currently employed and how many people we think previously would have been in the labor force. And so you can see it's at least a third higher. So that should give you some sense of the size of the issue. So what are some explanations? I will give you very quick responses to this and then turn it over to my colleagues. But one is just the massive dislocation. So that when we all have, I think, in our mind, the concept of a recession like we had in the 50s. Like you have a big auto manufacturer, people stop buying cars for a couple months, the auto manufacturer says, oh my gosh, we have too many cars, because they look out at their lot and there's too many cars, and so they tell their workers to take a couple weeks off. They take a couple weeks off, and eventually people start buying cars again, and they call their workers and say, hey, we got a need for you to build cars again, come on back. Those types of recessions, those recessions where you really are temporary and laying people off and calling them back to the same jobs, really don't happen anymore. Every time we've had a recession, you know, since really the 80s, it has been a recession of the following kind. There's a drop-off in demand, a company says we don't need you anymore, and effectively says to the workers, and we're never going to need you back for this job. It's not to say we're not going to need you back for a different job when demand picks up, but we're going to rethink the way we do things, and we're going to have people come back for different jobs. So the job transformation has been quite dramatic. So this dislocation is probably no different. We all know the stories about, you know, people telecommuting into work and then workers enjoying that telecommuting, and that really changing the nature of work for a lot of jobs. Extra unemployment benefits has been labeled as a potential cause. Well, I'll talk briefly about that. Caregivers, I've got some data on that, and then just the fact that there's just a change in sort of the need for, or the interest in workers working in low wage jobs. So really quickly, here's the picture on telecommuting. This is the percentage of the workforce that is actively telecommuting. And one of the things I think you can see that's really important is that there's been an uptick in the last month in the number of people telecommuting. So this is the virus, right? So the increase in the Delta virus has resulted in people going back to, if they had come back into work, they're now going back to sort of remote work for a little while. Again, it's not like what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, but it certainly is an increase in that direction. And that also helps contribute to some of these challenges we face. So pandemic assistance, everybody knows that initially workers were initially given $600 as part of their unemployment benefits. And then eventually it was cut to $300, and some states decided to cut it earlier. I think what's really important here is that, you know, you hear political arguments on both sides, from people on the left saying this isn't causing the problem at all, to people on the right saying this is the only problem that we have with the labor market. The truth always lies somewhere in the middle. I think what's important to realize is that the reason we did this was in fact to keep people home, right? That was the argument that we made for giving people this extra money, is to keep them home and not working so that they'd be safe. And to now turn around and say this is not keeping people home is kind of a silly thing and inconsistent with our previous logic. That said, we do have data on what's happened, because we've had some states experiment in terms of getting rid of this entirely. And it turns out that the quantitative effect at the moment doesn't appear to be huge. It's not a huge source holding back the labor force at the moment. It's probably some of these other things that we've talked about, the dislocation, the types of jobs, preferences, and the like. This gives you a sense, the picture on the left, which at the moment I can't read the details anymore and forget them exactly, but it takes and splits the gray line, which you can barely see, and the red line splits the states between those who have continued the pandemic support and those who ended the pandemic support. And you can see the change in employment over those two states, and you have a hard time picking up the difference. So there is probably an impact there, but it's probably not quantitatively very large. The picture on the right talks about the income insecurity, though. The states that are in the gray that ended the pandemic benefits, their workers look to be in the state of economic challenges sooner than the other states. Well, this is the one thing we know from all of the benefits that we provided. National poverty rates actually were the lowest that they have been ever this last year, and that is because of the massive stimulus and other support that we've provided workers, whether it be through the child credit, whether it be through these pandemic benefits or the other stimulus checks as well. We took a big bite out of poverty. Here's something I just saw on mothers' employment that I thought is interesting. It's a little hard to pick this up, but let me just describe the picture. The green line represents fathers. The solid orangish peach line, whatever that is, represents mothers. And the other two dashed line represents men or women without kids. What's interesting is that fathers continued to have higher, that is, they lost less employment. Their employment rates were higher relative to the pre-pandemic levels than the other three groups of people. You can see that there's some interesting things happening with mothers relative to women without kids through the middle part of this, the summer months. And then, of course, what's most interesting is just this last month as we've gone back to school, you can see that among mothers, employment has fallen. So this could be chalked up as a challenge with daycare after the summer, or decisions made to go virtual in the fall, right? So we know that there are a lot of schools, some that are back without masks, without other types of distancing, the kids can't be vaccinated, and parents making the decision to keep their kids out and then having a parent stay home with those kids. It could be all those things. It's not a huge impact, but I think it is something that is impacting the labor market at the moment. Again, I think at the end of the day, the story is about a lot of little things and not any one big thing. All right. So I think one of the big things holding things back at the moment is the Delta variant. Austin Goolsbee, who was a chief economist for President Barack Obama at the time, has been saying throughout this that the first rule of virus economics is the best thing you can do for the economy and for employment is anything that slows the spread of the virus. And I think this is what we're seeing here in the hopeful summer that's turned into a disappointing fall and slowed things down is the rise of this, the Delta variant, and that resulting in people. This event is a prime example. Not a lot of people wanted to be here in person. We had at the university our scholarship events. We're trying to get scholarship donors to come back, and people have just expressed a reticence to return to in person, and that has impacts for the economy, and you can imagine that has impacts in the labor market as well. The one thing I do think is interesting that I want to point out, though, is sometimes employers are slow to adjust. So this is a picture of what's happening with the unemployment rate and what's happening with the educational requirements. I recall having a conversation in a previous boom period of the economy with a local banking employer, and they were troubled by the fact they weren't getting anybody to apply for the position. I read the position and said, well, I know why you're not getting any new graduates to apply. It says they have to have 5 years of experience in the position or a similar position, and my undergraduates don't graduate with that kind of experience. He's like, oh, well, we didn't need that. And I said, well, one thing we do train the students to do here is read, and they did a good job of reading, and so that's why they didn't apply. And so they immediately got rid of that. I think we oftentimes are slow to adjust our expectations in terms of who we want for the job. We're slow to adjust to the state of the market, and because that information comes to us slowly. And so I think that can be a little bit what's going on here at the same time, which is why I think, McDonald's is hiring 14 and 15-year-olds as they sort of realize that this is another potential market to tap into. That's a little bit of a joke, but not entirely, I guess. And Megan might talk a little bit about that. So the last thing I want to say, though, besides the hiring of 14 and 15-year-olds, is also when we talk about labor shortages, we also know just down the road at Fort McCoy, we've welcomed a lot of Afghan refugees, immigrants to town, and that nothing's better for labor supply than a massive amount of immigration. And so we've had a different view on immigration of late, and one way we can improve the labor demand problems that we face is to be more welcoming to increases in labor supply from outside the country, since, as I point out to people, 18 years ago, people didn't have the fertility and foresight to have enough kids to deliver them to the labor market today. With that, I want to turn it over to Megan.
Thank you. So in Minnesota, we did have 4 new stores and 3 rebuilds. In Iowa, 14 new stores and 1 rebuild. And then at the beginning of our fiscal year, we actually took on a new chain. It was the Stop and Go acquisition, and we added over 30 stores. 21 of them, we retained the name of Stop and Go, and 11 of them moved to the Quick Trip, Quick Star stores. So this next slide kind of walks us through where we are today. So we're in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. And now, because of the Stop and Go acquisition, we're also in Upper Illinois. Does this mean I'm also having issues with this microphone? Okay, I'm good. All right. And then coming up here, we're also going to be in the Upper Peninsula. Then in 2023, we're going to be in South Dakota, and then North Dakota, and into Nebraska. So while we opened 73 stores this fiscal year, we are generally going to be opening about 50 new stores a year. So when we talk about the impacts of the labor shortage here at Quick Trip, we're generally talking about a few different buckets. One is the new stores. So the new stores, like I said, generally we'd love them to be fully staffed within 2 to 3 months of them opening. Unfortunately, that is not always occurring. I could give you a few examples, but just in generalities, if we want 40 to 45 new coworkers, we have ones that are opening in the next couple of months that maybe have 14 currently hired. So that adds a significant amount of stress on not only the leadership, but the existing coworkers in those stores where maybe they will be working additional hours, or we will need to pull other coworkers from other stores into those locations. And that brings me to the next topic, which is the existing stores. So while not every store has significant staffing needs, the vast majority of them do have some sort of a lack of the coworker base that they would love to have to be fully staffed. So out of our 781 stores, many of them are short. If you asked our retail folks, they would say that they would love another 3,500 coworkers. They would also love anywhere between 150 to 400 assistant store leaders. So this kind of brings us back to not only Quick Trip as a whole, but also what's here in La Crosse. So our uniqueness in La Crosse is our vertically integrated campus. So not only do we have the 2 districts or 32 stores within 30 miles of La Crosse, we also have the campus. So we have the 4 production facilities, we have a truck shop, fuels, we have our clinic, we have a food safety lab, distributions, 2 different fleets of commercial drivers, and over 600 unique positions right here in La Crosse. So when you talk about adding 50 or 75 new stores a year, that puts a significant burden then on the campus to staff up. So this is just an illustration of how many coworkers we have here on campus for our fiscal year. Our fiscal year actually ends at the end of this month, so I'm just kind of estimating here. That was as of September 1st, so that number will end up even higher than it is today. So already from the beginning of our fiscal year to 1 month short, we've added 551 coworkers to our campus. So that means, obviously our needs are up. The La Crosse County is not necessarily growing at the same rate that we are, and even if we went out to the La Crosse Metro, the same would be true. So that kind of brings us to our little bit of a quandary that we're trying to work through. So we have increasing needs. Our area population isn't necessarily going straight down. Clearly it's not. It's just about flat, or maybe receding just a little bit. But the pool of candidates is lower than it typically has been. So we've kind of got the trifecta going on. And Theresa is going to be talking a little bit more about maybe why that pool of candidates is not as active as they have been in the past. So really this puts, I think my role here was to talk about what does this mean? What does it do to employers? It puts a great deal of pressure not only on leaders, but coworkers, and then ultimately does impact our guests. The whole reason that we're here is to provide, employment opportunities for coworkers to grow, advance, have fun, and love their jobs, and ultimately make a difference then in the lives of our coworkers and our guests. And when you're really, really short, that's really, really hard to do. So just to kind of touch briefly on what we're trying to do about it. TJ talked a lot about, from the economist perspective, that maybe wages is the answer. We know that it's not all the answer because we have people coming to us on a regular basis that are taking a 50% wage cut because they'd much rather have the work-life balance that we can offer. But we also know that if we didn't raise wages like we have been, we would not be competitive. So it's obviously very costly to an employer, and unfortunately, there's a lot of employers that won't be able to make the adjustments that we have. So about 90% of our retail coworkers have already received at least one market adjustment. Some of those are actually within the next couple of weeks going to be receiving their second market adjustment, and I don't see that necessarily stopping anytime soon. It is just a highly competitive environment where we know that we need, in order to get the number of coworkers that we need and to be competitive and fair to them, that we do need to raise wages, which obviously has an expense to it. But it's really more of also about, it's a deeper thing that's happened besides the wages. You know, people's values, their expectations, what they're looking for in an employer has changed, and we're doing our best to try to move as quickly as we can with regard to that. So, you know, some of the items with regard to benefits that we are working on, we do have one item that will be starting at the fall of 2022, but QuickTrip has secured property to add a early learning or child care center, and we're very excited about that opportunity. We do feel like it is a barrier to employment for some coworkers, and we'd like nothing more than to help not only our coworkers, but by pulling out our coworkers from the community, that ultimately does help the community by opening up spots in other child care centers. We've also stood up some virtual mental health benefits. We know that our coworkers have been through a lot, not only personally but professionally. You know, while at work, they've dealt with social unrest, they've dealt with violent acts, they've dealt with people who were for masks, against masks, they've dealt with severe weather. And frankly, a lot of them are tired. You know, people can do extraordinary things for periods of time, but eventually it does get tiring. And so we're doing our best to not only work on that recruitment and retention, but also create programs and policies that make the work more enjoyable for everybody. We're also trying to work on the long-term recruitment, and this actually started before the labor market got as tight as it is today, fortunately. So we did add a campus inclusion specialist in her job. While she works in the recruiting department, she doesn't do interviews, she doesn't do phone screens. She is just simply focused on building those relationships with different groups in order to get the great word out about QuickTrip and the opportunities there, but also to provide opportunities for those, whether they're youth or other students, in order to help improve their lives. For those of you who aren't aware, we've, for over 30 years, have had a position called a retail helper. So these are individuals with disabilities. And so this position is really for people with disabilities, where we provide them a very competitive wage, an opportunity to be part of a team and do meaningful work. And frankly, they're just a lifesaver for many of our stores. We have hundreds of them now, over 570, and we have 70 open recs. And we would love nothing more to fill all of them. We're also working on developing our coworkers. QuickTrip has a history of doing that successfully, but we're trying to more formalize that, create some of those career pathing and other items so that people understand maybe what are the skills that they need in order to get to that next level, and then help them get there. And then the last item that we're really trying to work on is those partnerships. So I showed the graph of the La Crosse area. We understand that we're not necessarily growing as quickly as we would love our community to. So we've invested in the Chamber's Talent Attraction Campaign, and are a founding member of that. And we do hope to help recruit people into our community that will not only benefit QuickTrip, but other employers with trailing spouses or significant others or family members. We also just got into a partnership with UWL and our sponsor of their integrated core program. Very excited about that opportunity to help educate, be part of that learning process for the business students. We think it will be helpful to them, but also to QuickTrip to get the great word out. We also work with the La Crosse School District, Western, and many other institutional organizations in order to, again, work on those career pathings, understand what the students' needs are, and where we can help them. So hopefully I've provided some level of insight as to, you know, the employer perspective. You know, certainly this is nothing unique to QuickTrip. You know, we maybe had a little bit more of a challenge because of the La Crosse campus, but there are many small employers that, frankly, the struggle was probably even far more significant because we never had to go through the shutdown like they did. So I think that's really what I have. And next up is Theresa. So thank you very much.
I'm just going to grab that from you. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Theresa Pierce. I'm going to probably both sit and stand, so I'll do a little medium between Megan and TJ. I am the Executive Director of Workforce Connections, and Workforce Connections provides employment and training programs in Western Wisconsin. So we work out of the Job Center down on East Avenue, but we also provide services to people who are looking for employment throughout Western Wisconsin. And so we have a unique perspective on how some people have weathered through the pandemic, but also how they're coming out of the pandemic. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'll probably be a touch redundant to Megan and TJ, but I'll work my way through that. So where did all the workers go? So let's take a minute and just turn back the clock a little bit because we're looking forward to where are they today, but what happened to them prior to this? So prior to the 2020 pandemic, you'll remember that we had a labor shortage. We always had a childcare shortage. We were struggling with housing. We were struggling with connectivity within the rural areas. We're not able to get connectivity. We always have had rural transportation issues, and access to healthcare has always been an issue. So those things stayed in place, and then we got exploded by a pandemic, which just absolutely exacerbated each and every one of those issues. And so we look at March of 2020. So we were already going into that. We look at March of 2020. I always go back to the day the NBA canceled the rest of their season. That was my reality check for the pandemic. I don't know. Everybody's got that moment where they realize, boy, this is real. For some people, it's when the World Health Organization declared it to be a pandemic. But that March 17th time was really important. So as we look at where did the workers go now, we want to look at what happened to the workers then. And so you'll note that some people were identified as non-essential and were simply laid off. Some people were identified as essential and then asked to work on site in environments that they may not have felt safe in. It was a time where we didn't always have the PPE, the protective equipment, and people were going to work, told they had to come to work, but weren't necessarily feeling safe. Some were asked to close their self-employment businesses, hairdressers, nail salons. There were a number of places that was their livelihood. They were told they couldn't do that work any longer. Some were identified as either essential or non-essential, but could work from home, and so adjustments were made. So you're seeing people kind of fall into different categories. Some were identified as capable of working a hybrid model. So they were able to go home and they were also able to go to work. But for the most part, there were a bulk of people who did not feel that their work was valued. The minute, if you go back to TJ's drop, the minute that all happened, they were trying to figure out what value they brought to the workforce. You've probably seen this meme out on social media. We were all in the same storm, but we were in very different boats. And that's really important to keep in mind because how I weathered the pandemic storm is very different than how other people weathered the pandemic storm. So what we look at are the 7 pillars of healthy families. Do you have a stable partner and a stable spouse? If your partner is struggling with whether it be addiction or domestic abuse or anything like that, that's stability isn't there. In a perfect world, you have stable income, stable housing, stable childcare, stable healthcare, reliable transportation, and reliable connectivity. If in fact any of those are shaky to begin with, they're going to keep shaking when you lose one of the others. So if you had a stable job and income and then all of a sudden you didn't, the whole house starts to shake, so to speak. So the federal government stepped in and they actually provided 2 pieces of legislation. This isn't all-encompassing, but what they were trying to do is keep everybody at home and keep everybody safe and keep everybody so they could feed their families. So if you recall, on March 14th, we had the Families First legislation. It provided for free coronavirus testing. It provided for secured paid emergency leave, and it enhanced those unemployment insurance benefits. And that's what people are looking at today. They're looking at these enhanced insurance benefits and saying, boy, that's the reason people are staying out of the market. But it really did what it was designed to do, which was keep people at home safe during a pandemic. It also strengthened food security initiatives, and it increased Medicaid funding to states. It did other things, but those were the key ones. The second one was then the CARES Act. And the CARES Act actually provided cash payments of $1,200 to families and an additional $500 per child. That was critical for families to be able to keep doing what they needed to do, which was stay home and take care of their family during a pandemic. But they also expanded unemployment insurance, including part-time self-employment, and that gig economy was critical to keeping people safe and housed at a time that they couldn't go out and make a living. They had forgivable loans and requirement for private and public insurers to cover prevention and treatment. So those are big things. And so everybody was trying to provide enough support to families and employees that once the pandemic ended, they could come back out on the other side. So let's take a look at it. They weathered their storm through federal assistance, state assistance, family assistance, housing assistance, food assistance, healthcare, transportation, connectivity. And finally, March of 2021, the vaccine was widely available, help is here, and we're all ready to get back to work. And some of those families that went through that storm, their boat is still on the side, benched on the side of the beach, not ready to come back and sail yet. Some people are sailing and they're up and running and they're doing everything they need, but others are still just kind of sorting through it. We all look and we say, help wanted, let's go, bring this economy right back up, and people aren't always there where we need them to be. So now where are those same workers that were struggling a year ago? In federally, the big picture, and TJ can speak to this much more in depth than I can, but you can see that totally we lost about 22 million jobs through the pandemic. We have brought back about 17 million of those jobs, so there's a gap of about 5.5 million jobs that are still open. And so we're trying to figure out how we're going to fill those jobs. And so that's a big picture, rough numbers. So in July of 2021, Indeed, the hiring lab, went out and asked people, why are you not working? Why are you, if you're not actively looking for work, why are you not actively looking for work? And 10% of them said they were receiving UI. That's not nearly the number you think it's going to be. Most people think everybody's just taking their UI payment and they're leaving, but that's not necessarily the case. 17% said they have caregiving responsibilities. Mom and dad were a sandwich generation, so you might be taking care of your folks, but you might also be taking care of your children. There might be a financial cushion in your life, and good. That's great that there's a savings account or some way that you're able to manage staying out of the workforce for a while. 18% said they had a spouse with stable income, and so you could see from TJ's slide that having that spouse in the workforce was really important for family stability. And 17% were saying COVID fears. Now, this was July. I would guess if they did the same survey next month, that COVID fears would be a lot higher. The way we look at it is that there's 3 buckets of employees. The first bucket are receiving their UI, and they're either already back to work or they'll go back to work as soon as the benefit expires. There's a lot of people back to work. The second bucket is people who have received the UI, but once it expires, they're still not going to go back to work because they have childcare related issues or school related issues, and there's just too much uncertainty with the pandemic to make them feel confident that now's the time to go back into the workforce. Removing that UI payment we may think that's a stick, but what's happening is that actually pulls money out of the economy for them to be able to pay for the food and clothing that they need for their kids. So although they're wanting to go back to work, they're not able to because of the where they're at with the kids, and so therefore that's just money that's not available in the economy any longer. And finally, and this is really the unique piece to this pandemic, people have received UI, but they are simply not willing to go back to their entry-level work in the traditional sense. This year of the pandemic allowed them to either upskill, change their careers, start their own business, but it really allowed people to reflect on what do they want to do with their life. And there is a major shift out of the workforce or over to your dream job. So you might have kept doing a job you were doing because that's what you knew to do, but the pandemic gave you an opportunity to step back and relook at what that looks like. And for a number of people, they are taking this opportunity to say, I'm not going back to the life I had. There were a number of people who had 2 or 3 different low wage jobs, and their approach to this is we're not doing that again. And so having people who have 2 or 3 jobs, if you pull that person out of the workforce, they now have 1, so that leaves 2 different jobs that are left unfilled. And so I think what happens next depends upon the pandemic. If people feel safe to go back into the workforce, the economy will take off, people will go to work, and we'll have this should sort itself out over the course of the next year. But as TJ mentioned, if that virus keeps poking at this economy and poking at the workforce, we will not be able to make that the economy grow and develop the way we think it should. And so really, working through the virus helps us work through the economy, and it just can't be stated any clearer than that. For us, there's some post-pandemic workforce game changers. These aren't the only ones by any stretch, but these are some that have come up to the top of light for right now. Remote work allows companies to hire from anywhere and for people to work from anywhere. And so competition with New York wages in La Crosse, Wisconsin is a big thing. So if you can work from Toma, Wisconsin or La Crosse, Wisconsin, and you're recruited by somebody from somewhere else and you can make better money, there's an opportunity to do that, and you show up to work through the virtual systems. So that's a big deal. Businesses will need to revisit all aspects of their culture, including pay and perks, to make sure that they are places that people want to work. I'll tell you, Megan hit the nail on the head all the time. They're working really hard to make sure that they're a place that people want to work. They know they need workers. They know they need to be competitive. They know they need to be at the top of the game. They're not unique in that, but they lead that in making sure that people know we want you here. We want you as a coworker, and we're going to do what it takes. There's others who feel that people should just go to work for low-wage jobs with no benefits, and people are kind of rebelling against that. The market won't support that. As employees are working more from home, naturally, office space will need to be repurposed for other uses. You can see that on different campuses. If people are working from home, their lease that they had before just simply doesn't need to be that large anymore, and that will impact what we use that space for. And then finally, the $250 monthly child tax credit may provide enough cushion for some families with children to keep them out of the workforce indefinitely. And what I mean by that is if you have 3 children and every month you now have $750 extra dollars, it might give mom and or dad the opportunity to stay home with the kids, not monkey with childcare, be there for them when they're growing up years, and also then defer your time back to the workforce until the kids are of age that they are a little bit more self-sufficient. So that's really bringing kids and families out of poverty, gives them more choices, which is great for the family, but it's a struggle then for some of the businesses, no question. Bottom line, from our perspective, it's a complex issue. We really encourage people not to use the phrase, just go back to work. It's, if they just only had their UI, they'd be fine. That's not the case. This is so much bigger than that, and it's much more complex. From our perspective, the pandemic just shifted paradigms, and people and employees and their families are just resetting their priorities and their expectations of work and where they want to spend their time. And they might take a job at less the wage just to be able to have more family, but they might also do some other things that they've always wanted to do. So, though that is my story, and we can then take questions if you'd like to take questions.
So I can use the little podium thing. Okay. So. Thanks. Thank you. And try holding your microphone. If we can keep an ear on the one microphone, and if we need help with that, then we'll, somebody wave at me and we'll pass the microphone. So thank you. That was a terrific presentation. Appreciate the great information you folks shared. We've had a number of questions online, and my guess is you guys may have some questions for each other as well. And TJ, I'm going to begin with you. This was a question posed by Kathy. I think one of your charts mentioned folks in the age group of 25 to 54 as kind of prime workers. And Kathy wondered, how do people outside that age range, how are they viewed or valued? And has that changed with the changing job market?
So to be clear, the reason they use that is because there's lots of dynamics at play, both demographically with obviously the aging sort of workforce, and then their retirement decisions sort of cloud the data. So the reason we focus in on that prime age is just so we get a clear look at sort of who's working in the labor force and who might be working, who could work. But I mean, obviously, like this is the thing, my question would be to Megan. I recall, McDonald's would do this often, or Walmart, would hire when they get into tough straits, they look to sort of pull people out of retirement or provide part-time opportunities for people, and so they're absolutely valued just like anybody else. They have gained skills over the years and have something to contribute to the economy. And when we're in a tight labor market, some of the strategies can be to encourage those folks to be in too. This is just more of a technical reason why we focus on that particular graph, but I don't know what you guys do in terms of encouraging sort of older retirees to sort of come back into the labor market.
We'll take you, Kathy. No, really, our CEO is in his 80s, and we have lots of people of all ages because of the age-restricted products that we sell in our stores or the safety-sensitive work in our production areas. We don't have generally 14 and 15-year-olds, but we certainly have 16 plus. And then really there is no age limit. So different positions have different sort of requirements, like physical requirements where may not be attractive to certain groups. But it's certainly not a factor for us.
Thank you. So this would be another question. Mary Kay wondered on the Quick Trip, you talked about how you're developing early childhood development or daycare centers essentially, and she wondered if you guys are partnering with organizations for that, or if you're kind of developing that program from scratch.
We did partner with an outside facility just because it's very, very complex to get a licensed child care center off the ground. So we did partner with a group to assist through that process. We did go through a vetting process in order to pick that group. And then, but the team, I got to be part of the team just because it does significantly impact recruiting and retention, but it's really on the benefit side. So I know that group is actually meeting with a variety of different local, like the YMs, the Y, Parenting Place, a whole bunch of different community groups have come together to try to fix this very broken model. It's not that that people don't want to fix it. It's just, it's very, very expensive to fix it. As for Quick Trip, it's just an investment that our CEO believes in and is making the multi-million-dollar basically donation in order to get involved.
All right, thank you. And I think we saw that in some of the information that TJ and Theresa talked about as well, that those kinds of, child care is something that's keeping some people out of the workforce, and ways we can address that would help. I don't know if either of you want to say.
I mean, I really think as someone who has small kids who have been in childcare and struggled with that myself, like I really want to commend Quick Trip because not only are they taking care of their employees, but Megan's absolutely right that what it does is it really alleviates the rest of the community from that need too, right? So it really helps free up space elsewhere, which will have a very large impact. So I think that's really key. I mean, if we think about one of the things that has previously held back female labor force participation has been the burden of childcare has often fallen on them, and the degree to which we can make sure we have systems in place to alleviate them from that, we can have a full female labor force participation.
Wesley wondered how the perceived need for companies and businesses to achieve certain profit levels impacts the decisions as far as setting wages.
Megan?
Okay, so especially, I think Wesley's probably asking about public corporations or corporations that are trade on the stock market, or that have an expectation you really have to hit certain profit targets. And there's often a feeling that there's some tension there with, if we increase wages, then it's going to bring our profits down. What kind of thinking goes on there?
Well, we aren't public.
You guys are
private,
different, I know.
But,
so
certainly, profit is important. If you didn't have profit, you wouldn't be sustainable, and then we'd have thousands and thousands of families out of work. But
Microphone.
good idea.
yeah, thanks.
So should I start over with
Yeah,
that?
please.
Okay. So we are a private organization, not public, but profits are obviously important. If you didn't have profit, you wouldn't be sustainable, and then you would be out of business, and the tens of thousands of lives that you're supporting would not have that income. With that said, it's a balance. I think that, well, at least I can just speak for Quick Trip. You understand it comes a point where obviously you try to retain profits, but you understand that the math equation does not work. If you don't have workers, you don't sell products. You don't sell products, you don't have profits. So it's just a balancing act. But fortunate for us, we are privately held, and you have a wonderful family that owns Quick Trip, and so they understand that, and you don't have to deal with the same share owner type organization at a public company.
Okay, thanks. And
Private nonprofit organization, we struggle with that wage for our own employees to bring them in. When we look and see what Quick Trip's done, we know that we can lose employees and across the board, so it becomes a little bit of a competitive challenge to say, well, we want our jobs to be fulfilling and mission-based and things like that, but we too have to watch that dollar to make sure that we don't price ourselves out of the market, but at the same time that we're attracting quality talent. And that's really a challenge, I think, across the board for all areas.
yeah, one of the statistics that you mentioned, and this may throw it back to TJ, was also that when you take away unemployment benefits, that's actually taking money out of the economy that those people have been spending, which helps lift the economy, lift employment, that kind of thing. And I would assume that there's some effect there with wages as well, that if wages are higher, that gives people more spending ability and lifts the economy. I don't know if TJ, you could speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you've seen over the last 30 or 40 years is that labor's share of, for lack of a better, gross domestic product or sort of total income had been falling. And I think with this labor shortage pressure, you'll start to see it rise. I think the question will be then, and it's always the case that a particular firm might pay more for wages, and eventually they see a reduction in profit, and then they can raise prices as well. And there's always some dynamic at play there between that as well. What'll be interesting to see is, how long can they keep this up for before they really engage in some challenging what we call capital labor substitution. Like, if you go into McDonald's, or if you went into it pre-pandemic, the new McDonald's in town had just added the sort of self-order menus, and I'd be curious as to what Quick Trip has been thinking about sort of longer term in terms of technological solutions to this at some level. We've heard that people don't really want to go back to low-wage jobs. That's fine, but there's aspects of them that need to get done. Can they be automated, artificial intelligence and other things, and that would allow them to then move into higher paid, higher skill jobs. But I'd be curious as to what Quick Trip is doing in that kind of space and thinking about automating away some of the jobs that you have.
So there is pretty significant automation that occurs in our production facilities. So whether that's AI or mechatronics or PLCs and a variety of different items. And then there's some other areas that so far we haven't been able to really automate. And the idea of automation or the technology is really just to make the jobs more attractive, not to replace people, but again, once you have that level of technology in place, you have to support it. So that's a kind of a higher level wage earner, right? So it creates some efficiencies, but also creates some higher level positions. At retail specifically, we have kind of dabbled in the self-checkout. That's not been something that they've so far widely wanted to move towards. Again, I think the guest service is something that our retail team believes very strongly in, and they don't want to lose that kind of intimate connection with the guest. But that is something that I personally do feel like would save some labor. So I think that there are items that we need to do that we have not done that we're going to need to make some kind of significant changes because, again, I agree the wage inflation that's occurring right now isn't necessarily going to slow. And really, it does have cascading impacts, not only in the price of goods, but for example, we compete against ourselves all the time. So if retail raises wages or production or distribution or transportation does, we have a lot of migration within the organization, and that has significant impacts as well.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes, and I had a question from Rick. Do we know is there any data on the ages of those who are not rushing back into the workforce?
I did not see any data on ages. I know that the people with children under 18 are struggling to find that balance between getting back into the workforce and then managing their family. The deficit in childcare, and kudos to Quick Trip for doing that and actually having a cascading effect upon the community, that as those slots open up, that will help a lot of families. But until they can provide for their children, they're not going back to the workforce.
One of the statistics you shared that I found interesting was, I think, that 21% of people who were not going back to the workforce said that they had a partner who had a good position. And I remember a while back there was a book that talked about the two-income trap, how many families had gotten into the idea that both partners needed to work, but then they fully used that income, and so they, if somebody was sick or somebody wanted to step back from the workforce, they couldn't. And I wonder if there have been some adjustments during the pandemic as people have learned, okay, we can make it on this amount of money.
I think people learn to do things differently when you don't have those resources. And so you realize that you don't need to eat out if you can cook from home, and you don't need to do some of those things. Do you need to go to the movie? Well, we kind of proved Netflix manage that, and so there were a number of entertainment that came in, and so the things that we used to spend a great deal of money on, we shifted. We just thought differently about them, and I think that will continue. I think people feel freer to continue looking at the world differently than thinking they have to get a babysitter and go out Friday night and have dinner and go to a movie and things like that. I just think the world's different than it was before.
Anytime you have a recession or a big event like this, there are changes to people's consumption behavior, and some of that is a temporary change and some of it's permanent, and the economy takes time to adapt to the permanent changes. Or you can think about, everybody knows a grandma who would live through the Great Depression and stored her cash in the mattress. Like, none of us do that, right? But we didn't live through that experience. We lived through this one, and I'm not going into a theater anytime soon. I would like a babysitter and go out to a dinner, but those things I think are coming as we sort of reacclimate to our new consumption after this.
So we're basically at time. Last thoughts from you folks. What do we see going forward? Any big changes in the next 6 months or year, or who knows?
I go back to the premise and the principle that depending upon what the virus does is what the economy is going to do. And it's what wages will do, it's what the workforce will do. If we can get the virus under control, we can get the economy back moving. If that virus stays with us, all bets are off.
Yeah, I would say that I think 6 to 12 months, we're looking at sort of continued rocky times in terms of labor supply and companies being able to hire, and then that affecting their supply through the supply chain and that affecting prices. But I do think that most of these things are transitory. There's some permanent aspects that we've discussed about labor supply, but most of the other rocky aspects are transitory and will go away as we sort of figure out how to deal with the sort of new world of fewer workers.
I honestly don't know that I have much to add. I agree with everything they said. I think the next really at least 12 months will continue to pivot and change. And I mean, we're about on the cusp of our next kind of uncertain time with what may happen with a mask or with a vaccine mandate and how that would impact turnover and retention and a variety of different items. So I think it will continue to be an exciting opportunity to try to navigate it.
What is the old blessing / curse? May you live in interesting times. So, thank you very much to our panelists. I'm going to give you a round of applause on behalf of the folks online. There's been a very active community. And thank you for joining us. And a reminder that in October, our community conversation will take place a week early. And we'll be getting a little bit of a primer on the Black Lives Matter movement as our community-wide area has a focus on looking into this and working toward racial justice. We have a large event coming up later this fall for the community. So we hope that you can join us for that program, and thank you for your support.
Thank you.